We'll be starting with session 1, how will quantitative easing unravel? So please be seated. We'll be starting in 2 minutes. Thank you.
Hello, is this working? I'm slightly, yeah, okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the I guess the second session and the first sort of main substantive session this morning. I assume the morning session was substantive as well, but this is a session devoted to substance. I'm Rathin Roy. I'm the director of the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, and we have 3 panelists today. My job is just to chair the session. We have Sheel, who is an old colleague and friend who used to be Joint Secretary Multilateral in the Ministry of Finance and is currently still with the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council and has written extensively, most recently on this very issue. And he will have the longest presentation, so he'll go first. That will be followed by Subir Gokarn, who I'm sure most of you know, former Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank, and now has the onerous task of being a member of the Expenditure Management Commission. And my colleague from Germany, Heribert, who is a senior fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Both Heribert and Subir have said to me they will speak for about 15 minutes each. And then we'll have Barry on the stage, right, to take questions from a spillover from the morning. So we have an hour and a half, and that means that we'll have about an hour here, so 35 minutes to 40 minutes for discussion. So without further ado, over to you, Alok.
Okay, thank you, Subir. When, sorry, Rathin. You know, when Rathin had asked, Rajat had asked me to speak on unraveling of QE, I rather foolishly accepted with great alacrity. It is something on which I have written in passing. It's a very fascinating subject, and I thought it will be a nice way to get into the nitty-gritty of QE. But as I went deeper into the subject, I found how much of a rocket science it is. And I began, with a little bit of a mistake by referring to Subir, but I'm very relieved he's here, a former central banker, to, help me out with the Q&A if I get stuck on the subject. Well, I've structured this is the structure of my presentation. The first is what exactly is QE, and the deeper I went into it, the more sort of difficult I found, the clarity evaporating quite fast. Then the pros and cons of quantitative easing, and then the real substance, the main subject of the session on normalizing monetary policy, or how it might unravel, and spillovers on EMEs, which is part of the unraveling. And finally, some concluding questions, not answers. This is a cartoon which I came across in the Wall Street Journal on CDS. And the more I thought about QE, I thought if you just replace CDS with QE, it sort of gives you the picture. And here you have, a smug housewife reading the paper, and it's interesting the expression on the husband, who's supposed to be the authority on CDS or QE, who has explained this several times over to his wife, and she has not understood because the subject is complex, or he himself has not, understood it fully. So I do not know which of these two I am, because if I'm the person who's talking about QE, I'm not too sure I fully understood it. So there are various sort of views on what QE really is, and which I've tried to capture in a few cartoons. One is that there's a common perception that it is a helicopter drop of money, and this comes from Helicopter Ben. He's the one who started the QE, and he had written about quantitative easing before the crisis when he was an academic. So there's a common perception it's a helicopter, it's just a drop of money by the central bank. Then there is this perception that it was really QE which somehow got the crisis under control. You had, during the Great Depression, you had a protracted financial crisis, you had deflation, and with QE you were able to manage it, and things got in control fairly soon because of QE. Then there is a perception that actually it is a trap, and we'll come to this, why there's a perception that the central banks may have been trapped in QE. And there is also a perception that QE ultimately, it bailed out banks, and there's a major sort of criticism of QE. And there is this cartoon which shows, this central bank driving the locomotive, and these banks taking money out from, So then what exactly is QE? Actually, it is a subset of unconventional monetary policy. It is monetary policy beyond the zero bound to influence the yield curve, and where the central bank shifts from targeting the short-term interest rate, which becomes zero bound, to targeting banking reserves. How that happens, we can go into another slide. It puts downward pressure on long-term rates to purchase of long-dated government bonds. So one question which occurred to me, how is it very different from the open market operations of what the Reserve Bank does? I'm not too sure. There are also purchase, in addition to sovereign bonds, purchase of private securities, especially mortgage-based securities by the central bank. Then what is the relationship between QE and the helicopter drop? The helicopter drop is supposed to be outright money creation, and many people say that actually the helicopter drop did not happen. And some people say that it may have happened without us noticing it. And then there are two things which have been used, credit easing and quantitative easing. Now, my understanding is that quantitative easing is expansion of the balance sheet. And credit easing is that you take the balance sheet as given and you target specific markets. If you, let us say, target the maturity profile, the long term, then you can sell short-term bonds and buy long-term bonds, which was Operation Twist. Or you can buy mortgage-based securities instead of treasury bonds. So if you take, without increasing the size of the balance sheet. So that is my understanding of QE and the difference between QE and credit easing, but there has been a lot of sort of confusion on this. I'm not too sure. Here is the Bank of England definition of QE. One thing which it seems to me that QE certainly is not simply printing more banknotes. And this quote from the Bank of England, from the website, it certainly indicates that. So how exactly are securities bought? We'll try and go into that in subsequent slides. Now here is a cash flow, a fund flow of how QE works. That the Federal Reserve creates money and credits it to its own account, and then it uses this money to buy treasury bonds from dealers, and then that money is supposed to be injected into the economy for credit, or through the wealth effect through asset prices going up, and should stimulate the economy. And there are well-recognized risks, and the first is that of inflation, which has not occurred. Why that has not occurred is a matter of debate. And there is also a threat of future inflation that when unwinding takes place, and that is when the real monetization might take place. We'll come to that in another slide. That risk remains. And the other risk is of the liquidity trap, that banks may still fail to lend, and which is what really has happened. And the next slide will show exactly what has been the backwash. And the balance sheet is really funded by the increase in money in circulation and interest paid on the excess reserves, because these the depository institutions are parking. The backwash takes place because the institutions leave their funds parked with the central bank as reserves, and the central bank is paying interest on that, and that is used for expanding the balance sheet. So the increase in money supply is not quite as much as the increase in the balance sheet. And the next table basically, is a spreadsheet which shows what exactly has happened between 2007, April 2007, when the balance sheet was, just $87 billion, and the reserves were practically just $40 billion, which is really the minimum which was mandated. And these have now increased to, as of 1st of April 2014, to $2.61 trillion. So just to summarize the table, that what I'm intending to show from this is that, firstly, there's been a sharp fall in the money multiplier, that is MM. The balance sheet has expanded from 870 billion to 4.17 trillion, that is 3.3 trillion. And then if you see the reserves as a percentage of the balance sheet, it is about 75%. Now this presumably is the money which should have gone into expanding credit. But what has happened is that it has remained as reserves, the money multiplier has fallen, and the monetary base has increased, but the M2 has not increased in proportion to the increase in the balance sheet. And as far as the composition of the balance sheet is concerned, the two major components now are treasury bonds, that is the green, and then, I do not know, I suppose this is mauve, or is the mortgage-based securities. And the orange portion is lending to financial firms and markets. Now, this occurred in the initial stages of the financial crisis when the Fed lent huge amounts to financial institutions. Much of that has come back, and therefore, there has been this criticism that it has been a bailout of the financial sector, where the central banks. What is the justification for QE? That, I suppose, is fairly well known. It's to counter the effects of deleveraging and the drop in the money multiplier, and to prevent the deflationary spiral which central banks were criticized, Federal Reserve was criticized in retrospect in the handling of the Great Depression, and to expand credit growth and to raise growth. And also to stimulate demand through the wealth effect. Through some of the asset inflation is actually intended. There has been a criticism that it is leading to asset inflation, but consciously the Fed also believes that through the wealth effect you will generate demand. And then the third is the rescue of banks and sovereigns. And these are both the financial system and the sovereign. They are sort of systemic entities. They would need to be helped and bailed out. So did QE fend off deflation? If one looks at this graph, it would appear so. That when QE began, consumer prices inflation was falling sharply, and shortly after QE1, at least you were out of deflation. And as consumer prices started falling again, you had QE2, which began, and then again it pulled up prices, consumer inflation, and then QE2 ends, and then again there was a sharp fall in consumer price inflation, and then QE3 is not shown in this graph, but would have had this similar effect. So I suppose on deflation, the QE record seems to be, at least the data seems to indicate it was quite successful. But then what are the major criticisms of QE? One is that macroeconomic policies are basically intended to stabilize business cycles, but it is less effective in addressing structural problems, such as a financial crisis. And today, even in India, there is a debate over to what extent can macroeconomic policies, take you out of the growth crisis, which has some structural undertones. So QE, many people have argued, has been relatively ineffective in reviving economic growth, considering the sort of very aggressive policies that have been pursued. The impact on growth has been, very tepid. And as a result of that, there has been much greater reliance on fiscal policies than in growth crises in the past, because it is well known that fiscal policy is quite political, and it's a little dangerous, so you rely more on monetary policy. But during this crisis, there has been a substantial reliance on fiscal policy, and even the performance of fiscal policy has not been too great. The expected consumer price inflation has not occurred. People say is because there's global spare capacity. And the real inflation threat is really down the road, which so we have still to see. And then, of course, now you have the BIS criticism of QE that it is fueling asset bubbles, which the Fed disagrees with. And it feels that it is macroprudential policies, in any case, which should really be targeting asset bubbles and not a blunt instrument like monetary policy. So here is a cartoon which shows, captures the whole criticism that the Fed is feeding, liquidity to Wall Street, which is waxing fat. And, see the impact on Main Street has been, less than desirable. And on asset prices, well, this was at the time when commodity prices were rising. This is a graph which goes up to March 2011. And Bloomberg had come out with this graph, which we used at the time in a G20 meeting when there was a discussion going on, what is driving commodity prices? Is it QE? And the finding of the G20 was yes, no. It was a pretty ambivalent finding by that committee. But if you look at that point in time, looked at this graph, it seems that there's almost a perfect fit between the Roger commodity index and the expansion of the balance sheet. And if you look at S&P and QE, again, you see the S&P going up as in successive phases of QE sort of are put in operation. And this is a graph, a slightly complex one, which I myself have, put in place, which really shows that, if you take the period from 2008 onwards, when from the time when GDP growth has been quite tepid, you see the other, and around that time, the balance sheet starts to expand. That is the orange line, which really has gone through the graph, which ends at 400. This really is at 582 at present. So it has gone from 0 to 582. And the home price index, if you see, that has gone up from 2011-12. And this is the time when the Fed started buying mortgage-based securities. The green, although QE had started much earlier, but the housing prices did not respond. But once the Fed started buying MBS, you see the green line at the bottom, it goes up sharply in relation to GDP. But if you look at the others, things like the commodity index, the oil prices, you look at the Dow Jones, they've all gone up sharply, quite out of proportion to what's happening in the real economy. Now, the only outlier in this is commodity prices, which have since sort of leveled off, and oil prices. But if you look at it in relation to historic levels, they are still high. So is that the effect of this quantitative easing is an issue? Now, normalization. What are the constraints facing normalization? Now, there are two kinds of constraints. One is that it could derail the tepid recovery. They could be, including housing markets, because the Fed is sitting on a lot of mortgage-based securities. It could suck liquidity out of markets and raise interest rates and derail the recovery. So this is one fear which the Fed has. On the other hand, there are fears at the other end, saying that if these reserves go out into the financial system, you will have too much of liquidity and there would be a threat of inflation, at which stage the Fed would have to intervene to do something about it. And the other constraint is that during the normalization period, the conventional monetary tools may not work. And we'll come to that in another slide. It has to use some other tools because the reserves held by the Fed actually exceeds the currency in circulation. So how do you manage that situation? For that, you need different tools. So we'll come to that in a different slide. And then you have the fiscal stress, what has been described as the QE trap. That US public debt is already high, it has increased recently. And this would increase, could increase substantially if there's an increase in interest payments on fresh debt, if interest rates are raised. Because it would appear that the Fed will hold on to the balance sheet for some time. It will not unwind it quickly, and interest rates might increase earlier than the unwinding of the balance sheet. And why that is the case, I will come to in a different slide. And the Fed could also incur huge capital losses. And the estimate done by the chief economist of Nomura is saying that, you know, if interest payments, if interest rates rise to 3.75%, annual interest payments could be close to $100 billion a year. And the Fed could also incur a huge capital loss equivalent to 3% of GDP. And the Fed has a capital base of 50 billion. So that's a substantial sort of mismatch. Here is the problem with the rollback. You see the blue portion is the reserves, and the dark gray is the money in circulation. Now the Fed's tools are really, really addresses the gray portion. Now you need new tools to manage what is there as the excess reserves. So what would the unraveling of QE entail? And there are 5 different stages, and not necessarily in this sequence. The first is completing the taper, at which point the balance sheet would cease to expand. Now this is already in motion, and is expected by October, the taper would be completed. Then it would need to taper the reinvestment of maturing bonds. That is the next stage. It is as what you call bonds are maturing, the Fed is issuing new bonds. So once it starts tapering reinvestment of maturing bonds, then the balance sheet would start to shrink. It could accelerate this by selling bonds, which are still not mature. And then you need to exit the zero bound, the interest rates. Beyond that lies the interest rates, which I think central bank buffs call the pivot. When will the Fed pivot is currently being hotly debated. And then you return to the normal Taylor rule sort of monetary policy. And so the normalization of monetary policy is likely to be protracted. It has been described that really the taper is the end of the beginning rather than the beginning of the end of unconventional monetary policies. It could be drawn out. And the sequencing and instruments are not clear at this stage. It might be within the Fed, but at least in the public domain, there seems to be a feeling that the US Fed, 5 minutes, would probably learn through doing. What is a possible unraveling scenario? The interest rates likely increases before the balance sheet is substantially unwound. And this is likely to make the interest on excess reserves. The depository institutions are the ones who have reserves there. And the reverse repo, the non-depository institutions, they can get into, the Fed can get into reverse repo arrangements with them. And since there's what you call shortage of times, I won't go into this. But the expectation is that these will be the major instruments rather than the Fed fund rate. Even today, the effective Fed fund rate is lower than the IOER. So the effective, instrument for the Fed even today is the interest paid on excess reserves. And when will the US Fed pivot, raise interest rates? And the short point from here is that if you look at the data in terms of growth rate, second quarter growth rate, the current inflation rate, the unemployment rate, it would appear that it could pivot anytime now. But there's a great deal of uncertainty when this would happen. There are differences within the Fed. There is this there's forward guidance, there's this optimal control. But because of this uncertainty and the problem in communication, what is likely to happen is this. once the Fed actually pivots, there could be a market plunge. So my feeling is that there could be a market bloodbath at the time because of this great uncertainty when the pivot will take place. That could happen. I'll just take this. Okay, can the US Fed learn from Japan? Now, there are three major differences with the Japanese QE. One is that the BOJ could unwind its balance sheet fairly quickly because it had issued 3-month bills, whereas the Fed has long-term bonds and it has increased this maturity profile further through Operation Twist. The balance sheet reserves ratio and the GDP balance sheet GDP ratios are very different. And the Fed has a substantial chunk of mortgage-based securities in addition to. So it has to keep an eye on housing, on the housing market itself, which is one of the things which is leading the recovery. So I'll skip that. Okay, so finally I'll just come to the emerging market viewpoint. So when QE first started, this was the view which, this is from China Daily. This is the view which emerging markets took, that the central banks or the reserve currencies are swamping the globe in liquidity, the exchange rates were appreciating, and this was an issue taken up in the G20 by Brazil in particular. Then at Seoul, you had this standoff between the US and China, the US saying that China should move towards market exchange, determine exchange rates. China saying that, look here, you should not have competitive devaluation. So both of these are captured in the Seoul summit, declaration. And then here's another cartoon from the China Daily. Here you have this small, this simple, humble fishing boat of emerging markets, and you have the Fed riding by on its big, ship, and the danger of this small fishing boat overturning in the wake of the Fed, what do you call Fed policies. And this, of course, our own central bank governor has, made an issue of this issue. And there has been, huge portfolio flows to emerging markets recently, as a result of QE. And the main beneficiaries have been India, Indonesia, and South Africa. And so if these were to reverse, these countries could be among the worst affected. Okay, so a few bullet points on spillovers on EMEs, monetary policy spillovers. So the understanding is that monetary policies responds to the domestic economic environment, and the US monetary policy certainly, does that. But because of the overarching importance of the dollar as a de facto global reserve currency, all other central banks need to respond, because the US monetary policy drives capital flows, and EMEs in particular are particularly affected. Now, EMEs have been ambivalent on this. They were critical of QE, especially the surplus countries, when the Fed began QE, and now they are critical when it is exiting. Now, deficit countries are more affected by the exit, so they are more critical. So India has been more critical. And EMEs are particularly vulnerable. This could flow out. And EMEs with relatively greater structural macroeconomic vulnerabilities are more vulnerable. I'll leave out the next one, which basically, gives some data on the same point. How do you hedge against these spillovers? Well, one view is that you cannot have inflation as the sole target of monetary policy because you need to respond. And there's also a danger that EMEs may postpone adjustment because of large inflows. And this is what we realized in May 2013. Because of capital flows were coming in, we had a current account or deficit of more than 5%. It was not really affecting us, but we were among the worst hit when the taper talk began, because our macroeconomic parameters were bad, which you contrast to 2008 when the crisis took place. The Indian currency was among the least affected of the emerging markets. All currencies were affected, but we were the least affected. So you need instruments to deal with spillovers, both positive and negative, which could be a mix of macro-prudential policies, market intervention, self-insurance, and arrangements like swaps, BRICS, CRA, IMF. Then finally, 3 questions which I have in